Okay, we're entering the end game. For the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on image recognition and vocabulary, but that's only going to carry you so far, as I've reminded you more often than you probably wanted to hear. 60% of your AP Art History exam is an essay portion, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. But first, let me offer just a little advice about the end game, this last weekend before the test. At this point, you've taken an actual AP test. So what were your weak points? Go back and review those areas. I think the easiest way to do this is to use an AP review book, but if you don't have one, skim that chapter or those chapters. Remember that at this point, you're not only trying to remember images, although that's important, but you're also trying to remember the major features of each art historical period. Make sure you go into the test with at least 10 to 12 non-Western images that you can fully identify and discuss. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. Finally, make sure that you review the first semester works, especially Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and the early Christian works. You also need to know the main features of Romanesque and Gothic churches and what changed between these periods, especially in statuary. So, on to essays. For the rest of this podcast, I'm going to focus on writing AP Art History essays, and specifically, I'm going to look at the questions from the 2013 AP Art History exam. Get through what you can of this podcast in class, and the rest will be available for you on Moodle. Your extra credit essays also give you an opportunity to look at a series of questions, think about how you would answer them, and then look at the College Board's grading rubric. So even if you don't write these essays, I think this could be a very useful review. Of course, the 2013 questions won't appear on your essay test, although it would not surprise me to see some of these images show up in multiple choice questions. The College Board actually often does that, alternating back and forth between multiple choice and essays. During my after-school reviews, the day before and the morning of the test, I'm going to focus on major works that either have appeared or, in my view, might appear on essays or in longer image-based multiple choice questions, including works that would be good choices for the two longer 9-point essays where you have to choose your own works. You've heard all these essay reminders before, so I'll be quick, but write more. You have 30 minutes to write the two long essays, 10 minutes to write the short ones. Expand on your ideas. Download what you know, particularly on the cultural context questions. Talk a lot about the society, about the religion, about the culture, everything you can remember. And I don't mean irrelevant to the question, but you're going to have plenty of time to write these essays. Try to write more. Use your art history vocabulary. You have been practicing, again, these specialized terms. Use as many of them as you can. Don't worry if you don't know how to spell them. You will not be penalized if you get close enough that the grader knows what you're talking about. Where appropriate, include cultural details that might seem obvious. This is particularly important for this group when you get to Christian images. You attend a Catholic school, you are familiar with elements of Catholic ritual, of the Christian story, of the Bible. Don't just assume that you shouldn't mention those things because they're obvious. Nothing is obvious. Tell what you know. You have an advantage. Use it. Okay. Moving on to the specific test. Here's question 1, the cultural context question. And by the way, this one has appeared more than once in the past. It won't appear next year, but some essay, a short essay version of it really could appear in your test. So across the world, sites and structures have been the destination of people on religious pilgrimages. Select and clearly identify it. That means as much information as you can give, title, place, time, etc. 2 sites or structures of religious pilgrimages. Your choices must come from 2 different cultural traditions. As always with these, one must be from beyond the European tradition. Using specific visual evidence, in other words, to talk about what the work looks like. Analyze how features of each site or structure shape the intended experience of pilgrims. So notice that this is asking you not only to talk about the pilgrimage sites, but to talk about pilgrimages a phenomenon. This is where you shouldn't hesitate to mention the obvious. A pilgrimage is a journey. A pilgrimage is a religious experience. Some pilgrimages, all pilgrimages will have certain features in common. Talk about these. You know the drill with the cultural context question, and we've practiced it a lot. Please, again, come into the exam armed with some non-Western examples that you can fully identify and discuss. You all put together images for your Art of the Americas presentations. These would be very good to know. So would Buddhist and Islamic images. Ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian images count as non-Western, but the College Board doesn't like them as well. So use only those that you think, if you can't think of a good alternative. Turning to this question, the sites must be religious, which means that the intended experience will be religious. This is an open invitation to download information you know about these religions, but remember that you have to relate this information to specific visual evidence. And note the word specific. Do not talk about a generic church, mosque, or stupa. Again, identify a specific place. You should go into the exam armed with this information. I would highly recommend, by the way, putting together your non-Western images as a word processing document or as a set of flashcards that you can review one last time just before the test. I would recommend you focus especially on religious buildings, on sculptures that carry religious and or political significance, and on works that convey gender or family roles. That's where a lot of the questions from the College Board focus. With regard to this question, note this warning from the College Board. Not all religious sites and structures are pilgrimage sites. Appropriate choices are sites or structures that were intentionally constructed or modified to accommodate and facilitate pilgrimage. A religious site or structure not primarily used for pilgrimage is a less appropriate choice. In these cultural context questions, the quality of your choice matters a lot. Don't panic and just put down any old image you happen to remember. Think about one that is a good fit with the question. So here are some of the works that the College Board mentions as candidates for this particular question, or that I would suggest. The Romanesque era was, of course, the great era of pilgrimage churches. So what do you remember about this era? Well, it dates from approximately 1050 to 1200. There was a population explosion. Urban centers were growing. Pilgrimage churches were good for business in the towns. This was also the great age of monasticism, and pilgrimage churches attracted visitors and money to monasteries and convents. So talk about this phenomenon. There were several famous pilgrimage routes, but the two best known were to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where St. James relics were held, and to Rome. St. Peter's is very much a pilgrimage church, and we'll get there in a minute. But let's start with Santiago de Compostela. By the way, the front shows a lot of changes that were made. You see Baroque and Gothic features, but it is at its heart a Romanesque church, as the plan should illustrate. So what features, and again I would focus especially on the plan, enhance the religious experience? Well, to be obvious, and by all means be obvious in answering these questions. It's huge. It has multiple aisles, a very large nave. This was designed to accommodate crowds. And in fact, the experience of worshiping with many, many fellow believers was an important part of the pilgrimage experience, and the buildings were designed to make that possible. Note the ambulatory around the apse with radiating chapels or chevettes that will contain relics to be venerated. Again, the big draw here are the alleged remains of St. James, whose remains were associated with victory over the Moors. There is a huge square in front of the building where pilgrims can gather. Again, almost all pilgrimage sites will have some sort of gathering place, so that's a safe guess. Note again, any pilgrimage church you choose will have this basic structure, so you're safe describing it. But use your church architecture terms, please. Remember that even if you don't get a pilgrimage church question, you could easily get a sacred space question. So continuing with Santiago de Compostela, the entryway has a tympanum. We didn't study this particular tympanum, but all Romanesque pilgrimage churches have tympani, so you're safe. They are designed to awe, terrify pilgrims. Remember that the gentler religious images, focusing especially on Mary, come later in the Gothic age. They're part of what's often described as Gothic humanism. Romanesque churches are all about fear and repentance. This tympanum, like so many, features Christ Pantocrator, or Christ in majesty, Christ the ruler of the world, Christ the judge. He's judging the world, displaying in his hands and feet the wounds of the crucifixion. He's surrounded by the tetramorph anthropomorph, that's figures of the four evangelists with their attributes. Remember those? John and the eagle, Luke with the ox, Matthew as a man, in this case the hood of the tax collector, and St. Mark the lion. Again, you won't remember those details, but it's the sort of information you might be able to pick up from an image. Remember that pictures are your friend. Use the clues in pictures. Now, you won't have them for a cultural context question, but you will for the others. In the archivolt, remember that? That's the decorated archway above the tympanum. You see the seated elders of the apocalypse, each holding a musical instrument, ready to prepare a concert in honor of God. Anyway, you're not going to remember all of that, but again, you might very well get an essay question about a tympanum. You know a lot about the Bible. Study what you see and describe it in the context of the Christian faith. You have an advantage attending a Catholic school. Use it. So here's the tympanum, or one of the tympanums that we did study in some detail, and it shows up a lot in the AP test. This is a good church to remember, by the way, good name, Autun Saint-Lazare in France. Again, remember that you want to have a specific rather than a generic identification if you possibly can. So you can describe this or any other Romanesque church entryway. There's an imposing relief on the tympanum, in this case showing the Last Judgment, as they so often do, including a lot of sinners being sent to hell. Remember again that pilgrimage churches are all about repentance. Note the imposing jamb. That's the structure on either side of the door. These are not filled with sculptures, but in Gothic churches they will be. And the trumeau, that's the sculpture in the middle between the two doors. Again, this is designed to create an impression upon entry. Remember, this question asks you to relate to the experience of pilgrims. All of these French pilgrimage churches were on the way to Santiago de Compostela. Don't forget that detail. Here, by the way, are a few more close-ups of this particular tympanum. You see the pilgrims on the bottom, and on the left you see souls being weighed. Here's an interior of the Cathedral of Santo. You haven't seen this before, but you don't need to. It's a pilgrimage church, so it has a huge nave and aisles designed to hold crowds. That's true of all pilgrimage sites. It will have relics. Say it, even if it's obvious. Do not hesitate to use common sense and reasoning to bolster your memory. Okay, we need to move on, but let's look at just a few more candidates. Bernini's colonnade is all about the pilgrimage experience. Huge crowds could gather, and of course, just recently they gathered again for canonization. So, Bernini's colonnade is all about the pilgrimage experience and about focusing on the majesty and glory of Rome and the papacy. This is true of all of the cathedrals over-the-top Renaissance and Baroque elements. I'll show a few. These are two works by Bernini. By the way, I have not included some important works by Michelangelo, such as Pope Julius II's tomb with the Moses or the Pietà, but those were, of course, also part of the pilgrimage experience of St. Peter's. But the Baldacchino, that's that four-pillared covering, and the Cathedral Petri on the right are by Bernini, a sculptor you very much need to know, and these again are all about the power of the papacy and of Rome. Now, this is the Dome of the Rock, another popular AP image. It is not a mosque, although there's a very important mosque in the vicinity. The Dome of the Rock was designed to show that Islam competed successfully with other big deal religions in the area. So it is consciously modeled on the Hagia Sophia, which at the time was the most impressive religious building in the world, and itself, you may recall, was modeled on the Pantheon. So, according to some Islamic scholars, the rock is the spot from which Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, accompanied by the angel Gabriel. He was taken here by Gabriel to pray with Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. After Muhammad's return, he called all who would believe him to join with him and be Muslim. Other Islamic scholars believe that the Prophet ascended to heaven from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque in the neighborhood of the Dome of the Rock. So this is a very holy place. So upon entering the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, Muslim pilgrims circumnavigate the The rock at the center of the building, by the way, use that word, circumambulate. Sorry, I said that wrong. Use your specific art history vocabulary. The ambulatory is decorated with mosaic inscriptions from the Quran. The College Board rubric on this question mentions these sacred movements, also with reference to Santiago de Compostela and the Great Stupa, which we're going to see in a minute. By the way, I strongly recommend that you review Islamic architecture and how it relates to the 5 pillars of Islam. I'm going to talk about that more in this podcast. You may want to try to get that far. Mosques show up all the time in image-based questions as well as essay questions. So here's the Kaaba in Mecca. It predates Islam, but it is still Islam's holiest site. So talk about what you remember about Mecca. One of the 5 pillars of Islam requires every Muslim who possibly can to perform the Hajj pilgrimage at least once in his or her lifetime. Part of the Hajj is tawaf, another circumambulation 7 times around the Kaaba in a counterclockwise direction. Millions of people come to do this. Now, note that any old mosque is not really a good choice for a pilgrimage site. The Dome of the Rock is a pilgrimage site. The Kaaba is a pilgrimage site. But you do need to know your basic mosque plan and how it promotes worship. So the mihrab, remember, is a prayer niche facing Mecca. That's the Qibla, Qibla wall is the direction facing Mecca. Talk about the role of Mecca in Islam. The courtyard is a place for gathering. Islam has a strong emphasis on community, and mosques usually have surrounding buildings that perform educational and welfare functions, hospitals, schools, social service agencies. The prayer hall, and by the way, in this example, you can tell by all those dots for columns, it was a Hippo-style prayer hall, is a place where Muslims can pray the required 5 times a day and gather for the required Friday prayers. The minaret calls worshipers to prayer and towers over the city, again proclaiming the importance of Islam. The Maqsura is an enclosure for rulers. Islam did not separate mosque and state. Missing from the diagram is the minbar or pulpit, but every mosque has one because proclamation of the word. The Quran is another central element of Islam. Okay, come prepared to talk about the Great Stupa of Sanchi. It's a very good example on a whole bunch of different levels. All stupas contain relics of the Buddha. Don't hesitate at this point to add details about the Buddha's life. If you've got a cultural context question, remember you have 30 minutes. You could also talk about Emperor Ashoka's role in scattering the remains among many stupas to encourage worship. Note that almost all pilgrimages involve some kind of spiritual movement in churches, through the ambulatory and radiating chapels, in the Dome of the Rock and the Kaaba, and the stupa through circumnavigation. The yasti on top, that sort of antenna, represents the axis of the universe. The Torana or gate welcomes pilgrims into the sacred site. Remember, the Buddhism focuses a great deal on the relationship, on joining with the wider universe, escaping samsara or reincarnation, becoming one with the Buddha. Remember bodhisattvas, who would be Buddhas who don't go there yet because they're going to help you. Meanwhile, you can tell them from Buddhas because they are usually dressed more elaborately and ornately, and they are a bigger feature of Chinese Buddhism. Quick Buddhism review there. Any rate, just as I encourage you to review the basic features of Islam quickly, I would encourage a quick look back at Buddhism. Remember the story of the Buddha, or remind yourself. The emergence of the cult of the Bodhisattvas. Remember that Thai emerald Buddha? That would be a great candidate for a non-Western work whose name you can remember easily. And remember the weird worship where the emperor twice a week dresses and undresses him as part of the harvest ritual? Look that one up again. You might, by the way, even get multiple choice questions about Buddhist art. You are certain to get multiple choice questions about Islamic art. Remember who Sinan is? The architect who worked in Turkey. Okay, on to question 2, finally. Throughout history, narrative has been used in art to communicate social, political, or religious meaning. By the way, this is the second kind of question. It will also ask for 2 works. It will ask you to come up with your own works, but it will usually ask for 2 from different art historical periods. So, in this case, the distinction is one has to be before 1800 CE and one has to be after 1800. For each work, identify the content of the narrative. In plain English, if it's telling a story, tell the story in as much detail as you can. Analyze how the work uses the narrative to communicate social, political, or religious meaning. In other words, you don't want just any old story. You want one that was significant for some reason in that period. Okay, obvious. For this and similar questions, you need to know your dates. I would strongly recommend reviewing your timelines. After 1800 really means Romanticism and after. The French Revolution is 1789, so the death of Marat is not an example that you could use for the second half. Lots of artwork tells stories, but make sure first that you know the story and you can tell it in some detail, and the work captures the story, and that the narrative is significant in a way that you can discuss. In other words, pick examples, this is true of all of the questions, where you can flesh out the backstory. Here's what the College Board rubric has to say about the challenge of narrative. The relating of an event as it unfolds over time is a difficult task for the visual arts. Because a work of art often lacks an obvious beginning, middle, and end. By the way, this would be a very good point to make in a shorter essay if you got an image that involved narrative. For example, artists have often sought to present multiple points of a narrative within a single image to convey meaning, as in the case of Masaccio's tribute money. Remember, that's a kind of continuous narration where we have three parts of the story. We'll look at that again in a minute. Or artists encapsulate a sequential event within an individual composition, as in Pablo Picasso's Guernica. In other instances, artists have employed continuous narrative to communicate a political message, as in the relief cycle in the column of Trajan in Rome. My big advice is if you get this kind of question, put as much of the story detail in as you can and talk about the way the artist meets the challenge of describing a series of events or a story in a work of art. So here are some works that the College Board suggests for this question. I've added a few of my own. Remember, you don't have to have a non-Western example here, but you do need to pay attention to the dates so that your examples fit into the required time frame. I don't have time to review all these works in my podcast. Toss out what you do remember quickly, and you can look up more as part of your review. If the College Board mentions them as good example candidates, they are also quite likely to show up somewhere else on the test. By the way, I think the Victory Stele of Naram Sin would be a good work to review because it would also be usable as a non-Western example, as would Egyptian examples such as the Palette of Narmer that I think you know pretty well. These are not as good. In general, the College Board doesn't really like Near Eastern and Egyptian examples as much, but if they really fit the question well and you remember them well, it's better to use one that does that than one that you don't remember very well or doesn't fit the question. By the way, one warning. Be careful if you get a religious question to use about using an image where we know next to nothing about the religion. The College Board gives the example, I think I included this in your extra credit essays, of the Minoan snake goddess. We don't really know anything about the Minoan religion, so it would be a bad example to use for that. That's important to be careful about in the art of the Americas, but we do have some information at least about some of those cultures. And by the way, I think it would be a very smart thing to go back and review your fellow students' podcast on the art of the Americas as well. Okay. Palette of Narmer. This is a great piece, well worth remembering way back when. It tells the story of the unification of Egypt. It uses hieratic scale or hierarchy of scale. It uses important symbols. It would be good to review those. And does a kind of continuous narration. Another very important work of continuous narrative is the Bayeux Tapestry. The Normans conquered England in 1066 and soon after made this extraordinary historical tapestry, which is one of the most important continuous narratives in art history. Above, you see soldiers going into battle, and by the way, military historians use this as perhaps their most important source of information about medieval warfare. You see the obligatory dead bodies at the bottom. That shows up in a lot of continuous narratives. Below, by the way, you see King Edward the Confessor summoning William the Conqueror. This was an important part of William's claim to the throne, helped establish legitimacy. This would be a very good work to look up on Wikipedia or something like that and just review. Excellent example to use for a lot of different kinds of questions. By the way, questions on warfare do sometimes show up. So here's Masaccio's panels of the life of Peter on the walls of the Brancacci Chapel. This shows up all the time. Note that the tribute money tells the story in 3 parts. Jesus being challenged about paying the tax. Peter's there. Then Peter finding the coin. Peter paying the tax. Do you remember Marriage a la Mode? This was an Enlightenment-era satire on the moral corruption of the aristocratic classes. This would be another one that would be good to look up on Wikipedia and remind yourself of this story. Very likely question on the AP test, some part of it. And this one shows up almost every time. You know the dramatic story about the abandoned, the shipwrecked passengers abandoned by the captain. That was a current event at the time it was painted. Remember the pyramidal structure. You saw some questions about this on your various tests. This is a work you need to know. Another College Board favorite. This wasn't exactly a current event. It was painted a few years after the event, but it was based on a true story. Know the story, know the painter, Turner, but also be prepared to describe how the painter used the drama of light and the bodies being devoured to drive the story home. This is a work that you could use for a lot of different kinds of questions. Another one that would be worth looking at in some detail, maybe rereading the section in your textbook, or again, good old Wikipedia on this work. Okay, Rodin made some very conscious and at the time controversial decisions about how to portray this famous moment in French history. Remember the moment? Remember the story? You should be prepared for that. Here's another big deal work, very important 20th century work. Picasso uses a kind of collage technique to show multiple moments of horror in a single painting. You know about the Spanish Civil War. What happened here, right? Include those details. I think Faith Ringgold's story quilt, and you have another one back in your PowerPoints, would be a great example to use. Do you remember the story this tells about a black couple that elopes, starts a business, ultimately succeed? But remember, if you're going to be talking about this work, it's also significant that she chose to use quilts to tell the story. This is a feminist work, as well as a work celebrating African American heritage. Talk about how that works if you wanted to use that. That, by the way, would be a good example of a work just to, both of her story quilts would be good ones to have ready to talk about. Here's the Migration series. Jacob Lawrence used a series of works to tell the story of the travel of African Americans from south to north. Still another narrative technique. Rubens used the same technique in his painting series on Marie de Medici. He did a series of paintings about her life. Okay, question 3. This is a general view in detail. You'll see the detail in a moment of the Arch of Constantine. What was the intended meaning of this monument? How did the reuse of sculptural fragments from other Roman works reinforce the intended meaning? This is where you download as much as you can remember about Roman imperial arches and the general impress and awe the masses purpose of Roman architecture. Then you add Constantine's efforts to appropriate the glories of Rome for his new Roman Empire. Remember, this was designed to commemorate Constantine's victory over Maxentius, a rival would-be emperor, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, where he saw the vision that led to his conversion to Christianity. The monument was commissioned by the Roman Senate, so this one does not, in fact, include Christian symbols. That's going to come later. At this point, Constantine is establishing his credibility within Rome. Place between, by the way, reviewing the Constantinian era and late Christian work is is a very good idea. The tetrarchs, for example, show up frequently. Placed between the Colosseum and Forum, the arch was situated in a highly visible and public location. That's true of almost all political Greek and Roman works. So that assures its message is readily accessible. It prominently proclaims Constantine's rule at the heart of Rome. Note the form of the triumphal arch, and we see that again, remember, the Arc de Triomphe under Napoleon. It was an established indicator of imperial triumph, and imperial processions would pass through these archways as part of the performance of the celebration of victory. So this was an important ritual. This would be a very good example of a structure that shows that is used in a ritual if you got a question like that. The Arch of Constantine is a deliberate reference back to earlier models as a formal means of associating Emperor Constantine with Rome's illustrious imperial past. And to reinforce this, and because he was cheap and because these were more difficult economic times, he reused materials from earlier monuments. By the way, this is known as spoliation, where you take spolia, elements from earlier monuments, and that's shown up occasionally on AP tests as a term. I didn't actually include that in my vocabulary review. I should have. So here's the detail that was included. The inner medallions are from a monument to Hadrian, showing him hunting a lion and offering a sacrifice to the gods. Hadrian was considered to be a good emperor, so Constantine was riding on his coattails. Well, I'm just going to flash now a series of Roman monuments that you need to know. What's interesting about the Ara Pacis, it's not especially warlike. Augustus was emphasizing that he had restored peace and tranquility to Rome, and you recognize his statue down the corner, right? This shows up all the time. The Arch of Titus. Titus is bragging about conquering Jerusalem. And by the way, this shows up, I said this shows up in the AP test. You can remember this one from the menorah. Trajan conquered the Dacians, and this is a continuous narrative showing the victory in enormous detail. One of the things that's interesting about this is that the construction of fortifications, the role of the Roman engineers, is particularly emphasized in this. And again, this is a very famous example of continuous narration and a work that shows up all the time on the AP test, as does this one, question 4. The work is The School of Athens by Raphael. By the way, you might very well be asked to identify this work. Analyze how both the subject matter and the style of the work reflect humanist interests during the High Renaissance. Be careful with this term style. They're looking for what is called formal aspects of a work: line, color, composition. What techniques does the artist use to convey meaning, to attract attention? You know a lot about this. Study a work when you get an essay and say as much as you can. Okay. The School of Athens represents, this is what the College Board has to say. The School of Athens represents the discipline of philosophy. It's on one wall of the Stanza della Segnatura, which were part of the papal apartments of Pope Julius II in the Vatican. Pope Julius II used the room as a library. It was where he signed official documents as well as kept humanist texts. There are actually a whole series of humanist paintings in this. This is just the most famous. There were 4 frescoes. It's filled with representations of distinguished philosophers from classical antiquities to the early 16th century. So it's very much tying classical antiquity to the present. The 2 central figures are Plato and Aristotle, but we also see Socrates, Pythagoras, Ptolemy, and Zoroaster, together with contemporary scholars and artists, including Michelangelo. He's in the lower center with his head resting on his fist. Raphael is on the lower right, looking out at the viewer. This is all intended to suggest that the Rome of Pope Julius II was a new Rome in an enlightened age, hearkening back to a classical era. The painting also includes self-conscious references to the classical sculpture and building of Rome that were popular at the beginning of the 16th century. No Julius II, by the way. He is an important patron and the chief patron during the High Italian Renaissance. Did you pay attention to the second part of the question, which asks about style? This means, again, formal elements such as composition, color, and line. Here's what the College Board says. The fresco reflects humanist interest. Its formal aspects are modeled after classical principles of harmony, balance, and symmetry in order to provide an idealized setting, flooded with a clarifying light that dignifies the prestigious gathering. With the use of one-point perspective as an organizing element, Raphael emphasizes how his interest in illusionism equates with an investigation of the natural world that humanists went to such great lengths to explore. In addition, the sculptural solidity of the human forms, as well as their grounded placement within rational surroundings, ties the schematic program to the earthly domain of man and human perception, in other words, to humanism. The figures are individualized, bearing the countenance of many of Raphael's contemporaries. Again, humanism. This suggests suggests a parallel between the dynamic energy of the Italian Renaissance and the antique past, ennobling the ideas and actions of singular minds. Moreover, in a composition that conveys symmetry and balance, scholars are grouped either with Plato to the left or Aristotle to the right, with placement determined by whether the scholars were interested primarily in matters of heaven or earth. So Plato holds that Timaeus, he's pointing to the heavens. Aristotle holds his ethics, and it points to the earth. That's a lot of information. Did you remember some of that? This is one of those you need to know works. Okay, you've actually answered this question before, so I hope you all recognize Giotto. He is one of those artists you might very well need to be able to recognize without attribution. By the way, you weren't actually expected to know this particular painting, although we did, in fact, look at it in class. The figures are Mary's mother, Anna, and her husband, Joachim. Giotto is hugely important to our story, and he always shows up on the AP test in some form because of the way he reintroduces visual and emotional realism to art. So he's proto-Renaissance, sometimes also described as late Gothic. As the College Board explains, the bodies are rendered not only as monumental, in other words, they occupy space. They're large, they occupy the space in which they inhabit. They're also given emotional depth with individual facial expressions and gestures. We see that, by the way, also in the Gothic sculptures. Think of the Annunciation and Visitation at Rheims. As Joachim and Anna join together in their kiss, Anna's hands delicately play with Joachim's hair, and they stare into one another's eyes. Note that you could come up with this kind of detail just by looking at the image. Do it. Here's more from the College Board. A range of specific visual characteristics connect this painting to formal or conceptual features found in other works by Giotto. Students may cite details such as the weighty folds of the drapery, the plasticity of the figures. That means they look like they're really moving. The use of chiaroscuro and perspective. It's not perfect yet. It's not mathematical scientific perspective. This is from me, not the College Board, but it's the beginnings of perspective again. Remember, we also had earlier perspective. The Greeks and Romans understood it, although not as technically as the Renaissance. We see the charged emotional content, all of which are deployed to illustrate the narrative. With regard to subject matter, students may situate Giotto in terms of the broader character of Christian iconography, as well as this particular painting's presentation of a biblical scene. Actually, this is not a biblical scene. The story of Anna is not in the Bible, so shame on the College Board. But again, if you recognize a biblical story, tell it. Here are a couple more works of Giotto. Remember the Arena Chapel. Giotto would be another very good artist to review. Question 6. These works were painted by two different artists associated with the 19th century movements called realism. Using specific evidence, analyze how the works reflect the artist's contrasting view of realism. By the way, once you get to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, you have huge numbers of isms. I would heartily recommend you review them. One of the things I would pull up are your fellow students' PowerPoints for the end of Unit 12. That would be a very good way to review Unit 12. But back to this question. Note, first of all, that the College Board does not ask you to identify the works. In fact, the grading rubric specifically notes that this is not required. What is required from the rubric is to answer the question. Students must define, at least in general terms, what is meant by realism. If students do not define realism, at least implicitly, they will not be able to analyze the works in a manner relevant to the question. In other words, they'll lose all their points. This raises a very important issue. If you are asked to analyze something, explain that something. If they ask about realism, if they ask about one-point perspective, if they ask about iconography, say what those mean. Don't assume it's obvious. Of course your grader knows. Tell him or her in detail anyway. That's true also if you get an art historical period. Again, I cannot emphasize enough. Download the information in your hard drive. The rubric continues. Students can answer the work by referencing the thematic and or stylistic traits of realism seen in each work. Still, do you recognize this work? It's The Burial of Ornans by Gustave Courbet, a very important, probably the most important realist painter. Remember, the guy's chopping stone. He's probably the most famous of the realists. And here's the other painting. This is by The Gleaners by Jean-François Millet. So, two French artists from roughly the same period. Both works were painted in the 1850s. So, before we do a contrast, what's realism? Here's what the College Board says. Realism flourished in France in the mid-19th century. An assertion of the artist's objective recording of the facts. Realism can be defined as an attitude towards subject matter rather than, oops, just a second. A subject matter rather than a specific set of rules or techniques. It reflected a sense of the seriousness and truthfulness of art and its capacity to reflect the world. Taking as a subject matter scenes drawn from contemporary life rather than history or mythology, realism purposely included individuals and events previously seen as inappropriate subject matter, like people in a third-class railway carriage. Remember that one? Realist works could be politically charged, either in artistic intent or critical reception, although this was not always the case. Realism could encompass a variety of visual characteristics. It could be highly refined, detailed, polished, or coarse, flat, heavily worked surfaces. In other words, the nature of realism is more the subject matter and the way it's treated than the particular stylistic techniques. That all seems straightforward enough. The contrast part is harder. What do you think? How do these views of realism differ? Well, the most obvious difference is the burial of Ornan records a specific event, the funeral of a relative of the artist in an identifiable place. It is notably unsentimental. The priests are bored, the kids are distracted, the promise of eternal life seems empty. The painting, by the way, is huge, the kind of size that was usually reserved for a big deal historical scene, yet the moment was clearly important only to the participants, which itself makes a point about the importance of ordinary life. Millet's Gleaners, like Courbet's town dwellers, are ordinary, insignificant people, but Millet actually rather romanticizes them. This is what the College Board says. Millet's Gleaners offer a competing vision of the real in which peasant labor is ennobled. Rather than the specificity of detail found in Courbet's work, Millet's three figures are largely faceless and wholly absorbed in the laborious mode of work called gleaning. Despite the toil and repetitiveness of their labor, Millet's depiction of the scene suggests a timeless vision of agrarian life. Although the figures are isolated in the open field, Millet opens a glimpse of a larger life in the upper section of the painting, where one sees numerous figures engaged in harvesting a field. What really strikes me about this question is that you could give a reasonably long and complex answer just by studying the paintings and talking about them intelligently, even if you didn't remember the work. So take heart. Ooh, another mosque. We did talk briefly about this mosque, which is famous because it is made of mud. But note that the College Board identifies the mosque for you, and it doesn't ask about the mud. It asks you to identify the specific features in the building that are distinctive to mosque architecture. Analyze how mosque architecture generically, in other words, relates to the practice of Islam. This kind of question shows up all the time, either in an essay form, maybe a short essay this time, since it could also be in an image-based multiple choice. Here's the plan. You should recognize these. And let's hear again from the College Board. The mosque was developed in the earliest days of Islam on the Arabian Peninsula. One of the pillars of Islam decrees that Muslims pray toward Mecca 5 times a day, an activity that does not necessarily demand a designated space, but is certainly assisted by the protection from the elements in a mosque, as well as a permanent and reliable indication of the direction of Mecca. Friday noon prayers, as established in the Quran, were to take place in a mosque in company with other Muslims, so the faithful could benefit from an imam sermon on moral, political, or social themes. Thus, every Muslim community requires a Friday mosque, and every mosque is required, when possible, to live within a convenient journey of a community with such a mosque. Remember that the mosque may have been based on Muhammad's house. At any rate, we see the open courtyard for gathering and fellowship. We see a hypostyle prayer hall again. That's where Muslims meet their religious obligations. There's a mihrab on the wall facing facing Mecca. That's the Qibla wall. For the preaching of the word, there's a minaret for calling the faithful to prayer. I don't see a specific maksura or a gathering place for the rulers, but they'll be in many diagrams. If you get a question like this, use your vocabulary. Now know what you know about Islam. You know a lot. And finally, you will get a quote question. I thought this was a particularly hard one. I'm so glad it showed up in 2013, because maybe you'll get lucky and avoid a really, really recent question. I'm not going to read this out loud. You've actually seen this quote before. The trickiest part of this question is actually to think about works after 1960. For our purposes, that basically means pop art, feminist art, the various earthworks. Those abstract expressionists, they worked in the 1940s and even more in the 1950s. So there are other choices, but those would probably make the most sense. Pop art, feminist art, earthworks. Surely all of the, and by the way, there are various technology and image works. If you remember the scary meat video, you could use that. But you can all talk about how technology has transformed art and life. I hate to encourage this, but when you get a quote, think about what it means and just talk about it. Use your brains, use your own knowledge of life and of art. I'm not precisely encouraging you to spread manure, but by all means, talk, say more. So what works could you use for this question? I'm not going to discuss these works. You've probably run out of steam by now, but here are some suggestions of work you could use to answer this question and that you could have ready for a question that's asking about very recent art. Oh, but first, remember what you're looking for. To address the relationship between technology and how people express the world, you have to talk about technology and how art is trying to both use technology and capture technology's influence. So anything by Andy Warhol would be good for this because he both employs technology. This is photo silk screening, very reproducible. He makes a fortune from it. But he also comments on the role of technology in our lives, the way movies and television and commercials define us. You remember the soup cans as well. Roy Lichtenstein would be another good one. It'd be good to remember the title Drowning Girl. This is an easy one to remember the title of. If you remember when you're going to use a work, the more specifically you can identify it, the better. You see the Ben-Day dots. This is the technology producing comic books, which he transforms, blows up, uses in art. Feminists often comment on the way technology objectifies women. One example is Cindy Sherman, who does all of these, she stars in these untitled film clips showing about how films depict female roles. And by the way, one of the great things about this is she has a whole bunch of untitled film stills, so you can remember that and then describe several of them if you want to go back and look at those. They're in your PowerPoints. So those are good commentators on technology. By the way, you're almost sure to get at least one example from that last unit. You were in a rush then. It would not be a bad thing at all to go back and look at the PowerPoints from the last lecture of Unit 12. And finally, Smithson is all about getting back to nature, but he could only build this work with major earth-moving equipment. By the way, spiral jetty shows up on the test all the time. Okay, I'm done. I hope you hung in there for this long, either in class or more likely finishing up at home. We're going to do a lot more of this in our Monday afternoon and evening review sessions and continue over breakfast on Tuesday. Enjoy your weekend. Get some good rest, but devote a few hours to art history, okay? In a few days, it will all be over.